Welcome, believers. Welcome, conspiracy theorists. Welcome to the wonderfully weird world of the Tinfoil Hat Fan Club, where we talk about all the batshit crazy stuff that goes on in the world, and there is loads. Right, on today's episode, then, I want to talk about the 1952 UFO wave. Okay, global. It was a massive wave, and it's very similar to what we are experiencing today. Okay, so the question we need to ask is, why do we have these waves? All right, so look, stick around and I will tell you all about it. Right, thanks for sticking around. I appreciate it. Right, the 1952 UFO wave. Although the bulk of the activity of the 1952 UFO wave took place between the months of April to July, sightings began in abundance almost as soon as the new year took over from 1951. And from there, they simply increased steadily until the early summer when it simply exploded. Okay? In response, it was also around this time that many independent UFO research groups formed, perhaps most notably the Aerial Phenomenal Research Organisation, APRO, right? Just to press further how active 1952 was in terms of UFO sightings and reports, according to Edward Ruppelt, during a 6-month period in 1952, 148 of the National's leading newspapers carried out a total of 16,000 items about UFOs. Furthermore, according to the Air Force records, just short of 20% of those remained unexplained. So imagine 20% of 16,000. Well, perhaps one of the most high-profile incidents of the 1952 wave is one that we will call the Washington, D.C. invasion, that saw several dish-shaped crafts fly and hover directly over the White House in the National's capital. Directly over the White House, they hovered. To this day, there's never been an explanation for them, okay? Directly over the White House. That's weird, isn't it? Okay. Now, the term invasion, while dramatic, is very accurate, and not just in the United States, all around the planet, sightings of strange dish-shaped crafts were beginning to come in. And unlike previous UFO waves, more and more sightings were beginning to speak of closer interactions with these apparent occupants of these crafts. Okay, so they were actually seeing them and talking to them possibly. Now, more than a wave, a plethora of high-profile and detailed cases, basically, as well as the incident over the White House that was essentially part of the wave of the sightings of 1952. For example, several high-profile sightings were reported in California during the year, often with witnesses being military aircraft pilots and scientists. Okay, because I always say that if you're a pilot, your account of what you're seeing is worth so much more than, say, me sitting on a bench spotting something in the air. All right, these are professionals, aren't they? Now, the Nellis Air Force Base, for instance, all right, a military facility with seemingly a long history of UFO sightings, also found itself at the centre of multiple witness sightings in the summer of 1952. And I'll mention that because at the moment we are having UFOs buzzing military bases. So this is nothing new. They're always doing it, right? What is perhaps interesting about this last example is the apparent attempt made to cover it up, dismiss and discredit what was becoming increasingly apparent to all aspects of the American population, as well as the world populace in general, that whatever people were seeing in the skies around the planet, they was definitely seeing something, as the hundreds of lesser-known sightings would further corroborate, okay? So in 1952, people were reporting it. They were being dismissed. And we all know that the military, the government, the media made you look stupid if you did come out and say something, okay? But people were starting to wise up, all right? Well, starting to wise up. It's only really now that we are getting a massive fluctuation of believers, right? So in 1952, in 52, it began to unfold. It became clear to all with an interest in UFO sightings and strange aerial phenomena that activity appeared to be more vibrant than the previous 12 months. And while there were hundreds of reports on record throughout the year, the sudden increase in strange activity would seemingly catch both the world's authorities and the press off guard. Now, military pilots experience more and more encounters, all right? So I'm going to give you a few examples. Now, shortly after midnight on the 22nd January, ground radar outposts at Nevada in Alaska would track a fast-moving target moving near the Fairbanks region. Unbelievably to those watching, the object was moving at around 2,000 miles per hour. Furthermore, 3 radar systems, already airborne F-94 fighter jets, also picked up this aerial anomaly. Okay, later on that day, on the other side of the United States, just south of the Mitchell Air Force Base in New York, came another military encounter. Now, just before 10 a.m., a bomber would give chase to a disc-shaped white craft with a dome on its upper half. Now, after several moments, the shiny craft vanished into the distance at unbelievable speed. Okay, so you had 2 encounters roughly about the same time on either side of America. Right, several weeks later, on the evening on the 1st of February, near Hootie in Indiana, yet another military pilot would witness bizarre events while airborne, right? On this occasion, the pilot in question would witness several moving lights. What's more, they would change colour from blue to green to yellow. Now, to me, that sounds like orbs, doesn't it? We would call them orbs now. So these orbs have been knocking around for a long time, right? So just after a week later, over the city of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, 2 United States Air Force pilots witnessed a strange yellow-orange object while flying a small little trainer plane, right? The following evening in nearby Baltimore in Maryland, a United States Air Force C-47 pilot, along with his co-pilot, would witness a bright white object moving slowly at first before speeding away in the distance. So a bright white object, again, sounds orby, doesn't it, right? So, in the early hours of the 26th of March, several military personnel on several different B-50D planes witnessed red and green running lights, which moved at high speed over Fort Stockton in Texas. Later that same day in Long Beach, California, 2 yellow discs passed overhead, creating radio interference as they did, right? So red and green running lights. Sounds orby, doesn't it? They do sound like orbs. So later that same day, in Glen Burnie in Maryland, on the eastern side of the United States, 2 witnesses would report a 50-foot flat silver disc. So although there was a slight increase in UFO activity in the opening months of the year, it was so discreet that no one could have predicted what lay ahead in terms of dramatic increase in sightings and reports. Okay, so this is just the start. However, as April progressed and morphed into May and then turned into June, it became apparent, at least to UFO investigators who were beginning themselves to become more organised, that an apparent wave was underway. So it's weird, isn't it? You know, why do we have these waves? That's the thing, isn't it, right? The national press, however, and certainly anyone operating in the official capacity for the United States government or military will pay little attention to this discrete increase. Well, we think that, but even if they were interested, they wouldn't tell you. At around 10:30 p.m. in Greenville, South Carolina, several amateur astronomers witnessed 4 reddish-yellow oval objects through their telescopes. All right. Now, again, we would call them orbs. They were only in sight for several seconds, however, and then vanished out of sight. So again, orbs again, I think. Now, there is no doubt, however, despite the increase in sightings and activity in the first half of the year, the absolute peak of the 1952 UFO wave occurred in July and on to August. For example, according to figures from Project Blue Book, a total of 401 UFO reports were made in July 1952. And even more intriguing, 320 of those, 75% of them, would occur in the final 2 weeks of the month. Now, Captain Edward Ruppelt would further remark that UFO sightings in 1952 were double the rate compared to the previous year. So again, why would we have an increase? Why would we have an increase in UFO sightings? I mean, it's weird, isn't it? Now, this media, combined with the already increasing sightings, undoubtedly had members of the American public taken a greater interest in the skies above them. Now, was the sudden increase in sightings at the time, when sightings were already increasing anyway, a result of a panic-stricken public, or was it a case of more eyes looking forward, resulting in more anomalies being seen? Now, that is a really good point, because that is my point at the moment, right? You have got so many people interested in drones that when they're looking at and seeing weird stuff, it's something they wouldn't normally notice. Well, whatever the reason, right, we will examine shortly. Almost like a flickering of a switch, an already busy period in UFO reports would suddenly explode, right? First, though, we will examine some of those incidents that built up to this explosion, okay, with, the increased in activity. What's more, the vast majority of these sightings were saucer or dish-shaped objects. Certainly nothing that would be considered terrestrial or a conventional aircraft. All right, even though they probably called them that. So, let's give you an example. Around 7:30 a.m. on the 1st of July in Lynn and Bedford in Massachusetts, two F-94 military jets were scrambled to intercept an apparent UFO following a report from a member of the Volunteers Observes Corps, right? Several minutes later, local residents, Mr. and Mrs. Nelson, witnessed a bright silver cigar-shaped object about 6 times as long as it was wide. And even more bizarre, an almost identical UFO would pass overhead a short time later. So there was 2 of these cigar-shaped vehicles. All right, so 2 hours later at Fort Monmouth in New Jersey, right, the same objects were spotted along the East Coast. Quite bizarrely, whether coincidentally or not, as soon as the Air Force radar became aware of the object, it would speed up dramatically in the direction of Washington, D.C. So as soon as the radar picked it up, pew, it was gone. Right? A short time later, a physics professor at George Washington University would spot and report a dull grey smoke-coloured object hovering in the sky. When the professor would speak to the press regarding the sighting, he would claim, based on the number of people in the streets, that there must have been at least 500 witnesses to the incident. So the following day, in Tremonto in Utah, Navy photographer Durbert Newhouse and his wife witnessed and filmed over a dozen shiny silver objects moving through the sky over the highway on which they were driving. So they've witnessed a dozen shiny objects while they were driving, okay? Interestingly, though, when the Navy returned the frames to the Newhouse, because obviously they gave them the photos, he would discover several key frames missing. Now, these actions, of course, would seemingly become commonplace in the decades that would follow, all right? So never give your photos to the army, basically. That's what we're saying, because you won't get them back, right? Now, by the 9th of July, several more sightings of strange aerial anomalies were making headlines around the United States. Perhaps one of the first significant sightings of that day came out just before 1 p.m. in Colorado Springs, Colorado. There, a senior Air Force pilot, a Major Griffin, would witness a strange white craft moving erratically overhead. Now, the beauty about this is they are professional flyers. They're not going to mistake birds, weather balloons, or swamp gas, are they? All right, if they see something weird, it is weird. Now, several hours later, around 3:30 p.m. in Rapid City in South Dakota, a sergeant and 3 airmen would witness 3 milky white discs flying at an altitude of between 30,000 and 40,000 feet. All of the witnesses would state the objects were moving faster than any jet aircraft. They were in sight for approximately 5 minutes. All right, so these are professionals. They would know how fast a jet aircraft would go. So they are saying that whatever it was speeding along, right? So at 6:30 p.m. in Pennsylvania, farmer John Mitty witnessed an aluminium oval-shaped object overhead, right? The strange craft would move in several directions as well as changing altitude several times. It then disappeared into the distance. 2 hours later, in Virginia, a national airline pilot would witness a stationary amber glow that suddenly disappeared into the distance. Yet again, describing an orb. What do you think? Sounds orby to me, right? At just after 8 p.m. on the evening on the 12th of July, reports of multiple strange crafts were reported in the north of Illinois. Some reports would suggest they were moving at around 3,000 miles per hour. Half an hour later in William Bay, Wisconsin, radars will pick up several similar objects moving at a similarly blistering pace. All right, so these, I mean, I'm not going to mention them all, but you can see it was a busy period, right? As busy as the first 2 weeks of July undoubtedly were, especially across the United States, UFO activity was about to go off the scale. Now, the second half of July, sightings go into overdrive. On the evening on the 15th of July in Pendleton, Oregon, multiple witnesses, including an Oregon state trooper, would report a silver-coloured spherical object moving with great speed overhead and an altitude of roughly 4,000 feet. It would disappear towards the north. Interestingly, around 10 minutes following its disappearance, 6 B-36 military aircrafts were also witnessed heading in that direction. Yeah, and I think they were chasing whatever that silver-coloured thing was. It's too coincidental, isn't it? Now, on the same evening, on the other side of the United States, in West Palm Beach, Florida, 3 witnesses will report a dish-shaped craft hovering over Palm Beach International Airport. Again, hovering over an airport, right? The craft, according to the witness, was silver when it moved, but bizarrely appeared muddy when motionless. Right now, would that suggest now what we're seeing that it was changing shape? Because apparently these things can change shape, whatever they are. So, you know, the muddy description's not a bad one, is it? If it was trying to morph into something else, right? But look, less than 12 hours later, at a little after 9:30 a.m. on the 16th of July in Beverly, Massachusetts, a United States Coast Guard photographer witnessed several bright lights from his station photo lab. Okay, unfortunately, he was cleaning his camera at the time, and that really does gut me a little bit, you know, because makes it sound suspicious, doesn't it? But the object was only visible for a matter of seconds, so even if his camera was working, I doubt he would catch it, right? Now, on the same day, a short distance away in Hampton Road, Virginia, 2 amber-coloured objects were witnessed by an aeronautical engineer. Now, his name was Paul Hill. They were moving with speed through the sky and turning on their own axis as they did so. Yet again, we're seeing that today, aren't we? Right? The 48 hours over the 17th and 18th of July would see multiple other UFO instances. Far too many for us to cover here, to be honest. But I will tell you some that stick out, right? So it says sightings of a silver disc across America. For example, between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. on the 17th of July, near Lockbourne Air Force Base in Iowa, 2 guards will witness a circular object with an orange and green glow. And we're seeing that, aren't we? They were approximately 5,000 feet. They would watch it for several minutes before it eventually disappeared. Incidentally, the same or very similar object appeared over the base that following evening. Again, okay, would we call them drones today, buzzing a military base? Sounds like it, doesn't it? All going on in 1952. As the 17th July unfolded, multiple sightings would yet again occur. For example, at around 1 p.m. in Mississippi, a state highway patrolman would witness several round blue fluorescent coloured objects, each at around 100 feet. They moved at various altitudes between 3 to 11,000 feet and were visible for about half an hour. I mean, that's incredible. And they were round blue fluorescent objects. Again, sounds orby, doesn't it, right? Several hours later, after 3 p.m. in White Plains, New York, Mrs. Florence Daly would report two round bluish-white objects flying in formation overhead. Perhaps bizarrely, perhaps not, Daly would report hearing many feminine voices as the objects moved overhead. Well, it's a strange one because I've never heard that before. But they sound very similar, don't they, the encounters, right? So on the morning of the 18th of July in Miami, Florida, a parent and daughter witnessed an oblique silver bubble, right, moving at great pace across the sky. Around the same time, several United States Air Force officers witnessed several red-orange lights moving across the sky. Again, United States Air Force officers. You know, you've got to take their account seriously. Later that same day, an American airline pilot witnessed several strange lights moving back and forth near his location in Denver, Colorado. Now, by this stage, the Ground Observer Corps, a volunteer service of residents watching the skies, would begin reporting UFOs at a blistering rate. And what was particularly interesting, given the GOC was essentially under the control of the United States Air Force, was the apparent lack of restrictions on how the GOCs could speak to and where their reports went, including the press. And according to some, these GOC reports were coming in on an hourly basis. The following day, on the 21st of July, the radar system at Dobbins Air Force Base in Georgia witnessed an unidentified blip moving slowly at approximate altitude of 52,000 feet. Then a second object moving faster than the first appeared on the screen. It remained motionless for several minutes before disappearing. Okay, so a weird thing caught on a radar. Later that afternoon, a military wife based at Randolph Air Force Base in Converse, Texas, witnessed a strange elongated object moving overhead. She would estimate it moving more than 300 miles per hour, and it was in view for about 3 to 5 minutes. So that was an Air Force base in Texas, right? An Air Force base being blipped by an unidentified flying object, right? That same evening in Rockville, Indiana, at a little after 8 p.m., 3 military pilots witnessed a dark grey triangular-shaped object moving overhead. It appeared to be at an altitude of over 1,000 feet and moved around 60 miles per hour. So this was a slow one. It would suddenly stop and hover for several minutes before disappearing into the distance. A triangular ship. We know how often they appear, don't we, right? Now, around the same time at the Rockville sighting, 2 military pilots would encounter a UFO while airborne over Blue Lake in Alaska. Despite attempts to intercept the object, it ultimately disappeared from their sight and their radar screens. Now, whether it was the same object or not, 3 witnesses over San Marco Air Force Base in Texas would report a blue circle with a blue trail moving over their base at over 700 miles per hour. This, of course, would be near sonic speed. So again, Air Force bases, what is it? Okay, these kind of sightings and encounters would continue with multiple reports daily for the rest of July. And while the vast majority of these sightings would most definitely come from the United States, bizarre aerial activity was taking place all over the planet during this time. These kind of sightings and encounters would continue with multiple reports daily for the rest of July. And while the vast majority of these sightings were definitely from the United States, bizarre aerial activity was taking place all around the planet at the time. And while the wave of such incidents, while still a daily occurrence, was slowing somewhat, public awareness and indeed interest in them most certainly wasn't, right? Several sightings were also reported from American military bases in Japan in early August. Now, on the evening of the 10th of August, for example, at just before 10 p.m., an American military pilot witnessed a strange object descend out of the night sky at an altitude of around 8,000 feet, so to about 15,000 feet, in a matter of seconds. An Air Force base, see, an American Air Force base in Japan is now being buzzed by a UFO. At almost the same time, 3 nights later, on the 13th of August, over the capital of Tokyo, another United States Marine pilot, Major McGough, would report a similar object glowing. Once again, it was at an altitude of around 8,000 feet and moved at an speed excess of 200 miles per hour. Furthermore, much like the encounter 3 nights earlier, it would spiral down to an altitude of around 1,500 feet. So it's dropping from the sky. It then remained visible, hovering for around 2 to 3 minutes before it disappeared, as if it went out. The details another that shows up more than we might think, as though the object was switched off, as opposed to moving away in the distance. Or are they going in parallel places, parallel dimensions? You know what I mean? When they just phase out, it's weird, isn't it? Right? Okay, a slower but still intense pace, right? Although they will continue at a much slower pace than the 2 weeks period at the end of July and the opening days of August, strange sightings of a greatly similar nature to those would continue throughout the remaining days of the month. So look, I mean, you can go on and on and on, all right, but the 1952 wave has to be thought about, all right? If you look into it, there's so many sightings. It reminds me a little bit like today. And I mean, a lot of these things could be explained as orbs as well. So look, what do you think? Check out the 1952 wave. And I will go back to the fact that these ships, whatever we want to call them, hovered over the White House. That's incredible. I mean, one more part of that will be them landing on the grass outside, walking up to the door, knocking and asking for a cup of tea. I mean, seriously, it's that close, isn't it? So look, this is the Tinfoil Hat Fan Club. Thanks ever so much for watching. I really appreciate it. The 1952 wave, what do you think? All right, so like, subscribe and ring that notification bell if you can, and I will catch you on the next one. Thanks very much.